Welcome back, everyone, to the Insiders Lounge. We have episode 5 today with Chris. Chris in front of me here. Chris, how are things going? And give everyone a quick introduction to get things started here.
I'm good. I'm good. Can't complain. Thanks for having me on. My name's Chris Peralta. I have my own agency called Joga Sports Group. I grew up in New Orleans, Louisiana, so I think I can count on both hands actually the amount of pro players that have actually come out of Louisiana. I know majority of them. So obviously soccer is not, comparable to football or baseball,
Right.
but yeah, I started playing there, just played club, high school. I was a very lazy athlete, honestly. So even if I was good enough to play like D1 or D2, I probably wouldn't have done the preseason workouts. So I went to LSU, kind of just an hour away from where I grew up. And then from there, kind of through networking, through connecting, got my first job out of college with Houston Dynamo of the MLS. And then from there, just networking, connecting again. Started working, doing consulting for like a sports science company that allowed me to connect even more. And then now I just focus on kind of my agency full time.
No, that's great. I always like whenever I meet an agent, one of my first questions is kind of how you got into the business,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
everyone, for a good like Jack that we had on earlier, like a few podcasts ago, he was obviously pro player, and it's kind of easier to make that route because you hear about
yeah.
it more and it's kind of in your world. But if you're not from that route, it's kind of a weird gap that most people that I go up to and talk about, they don't know what I'm talking about. They think it's this, you're either a coach for some team or they never really understand it. But it's cool to see all the unique journeys, because another way I see a lot of players or people in general get involved is working through teams like you did. So what were kind
Yeah.
of your, like, I saw you had quite a few different roles. I think you were senior staff coach. You worked in a few you were scouting for a little bit with them, but also doing some other stuff. What were some of those roles, and how did those kind of tie into now working on the agency side?
Yeah, the reality is that whatever role I was given, I had like 10 different other hats, right?
Right.
I wanted to work in pro soccer. I knew that. And so the opportunity came about, and I just said, look, whatever you put me to do, I'll do it. I worked they had a department called youth programs, which is
Mm-hmm.
essentially you run the camps, you run identification events, you do stuff in the community with the players, right? So I did that, and that was a big part. And then the academy actually didn't have like an operations person, so I kind of helped out with that as well. I had my coaching licenses. I think when I started
That's
at
what I was
Houston
going to ask.
Dynamo, I had my seat because that's how I made money in college. I coached on the
Mm.
side. Um, and club soccer. So I had my coaching licenses. So that also allowed me to coach in the evenings and help and be an assistant and learn. So it was a lot of different things. Every day was really different. It really depended on, the summer was heavy camp season, right?
Mm.
Doing camps at like YMCA, doing community events. And then August through December, it could vary between traveling with the academy teams or doing a community event with a player, translating for the player, because I know a couple of different languages. And at that time, we had Spanish speakers, Portuguese speakers. So I was kind of thrown around a lot of different areas. But
Mm-hmm.
at the time, I did not enjoy it. The pay was low, the days were very long, but I'm grateful for it now because it allowed me to see a lot of different aspects of different departments. It allowed me to network with a lot of players. One of them is
Mm-hmm.
is one of my closest friends now to date. He's retired now, and so it gave me a really good kind of understanding of, okay, this is what I don't want to do. Because initially I was like, oh, maybe after this, if I like coaching, I'll just be a full-time coach. And yeah, that's
Right.
not what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
And I found that out very, very quickly. So it gave me a good understanding of what I liked the most, and what I for sure wanted to kind of stay away from in the future.
And then getting into kind of the soccer world, was that always a dream from young? Like, was it ever a dream to go pro? Because that's kind of how every young soccer player grows up. They want to make it pro. Was that a dream, or did you kind of slowly develop? Like for me, I slowly developed realizing, okay, I'm not going to make it pro, but maybe I can move into another sector in soccer, which I'll love just as much.
No, 100% never even dreamt of going pro. That didn't even cross my mind. I think soccer was really, I come from a Hispanic household, and both of my parents were born and raised in Honduras. So
Mhm.
for my dad, especially, it was soccer on the television all day, every day. I wasn't even allowed to really watch another sport, or change the channel. So, watching early days MLS, Mexico, Premier League, you couldn't really see a lot of Bundesliga, but every now and then when they would show it, I would just watch games a lot. I loved watching games. I love watching different teams, different playing styles, learning more about players and their background and where they come from. So that was always what interested me the most, and the playing side not as much. Honestly, I
Yeah.
played because at the time, obviously, the friends that I was closest with played, and club soccer, in high school you're playing with your friends and all these things. But yeah, I never really thought beyond kind of like high school, like, oh, this is where I take my steps to go pro. Nah, none of
Yeah.
that.
And then while you were at LSU, you took sports admin and I think business as well. Am I right with that?
Yeah. So LSU does like a sport administration, which is essentially, it's majority business classes, as if you were
Mm.
a business minor, but business major. But um, when you get towards like your junior year, your senior year, you do a
Mhm.
lot more sports specific tailored classes. So dealing with budgets, like you have an events class, right? Where let's say you have to pitch why the city of Toronto should be able to host the World Cup, logistics wise,
Right.
hotels, flights, everything. How does that work, right? And so it's good because it gives you I think LSU does a good job of giving you enough classes to where you're well rounded in, and whether you want to sell tickets when you get out, whether you want to work in operations, whether you want to do player personnel stuff, marketing. It gives you a lot to choose from. So yeah.
Yeah, it's like that real world experience. You're getting
Yeah.
actual value out of that. And
Yeah.
then so then you went on to Houston after that. You were doing your coaching kind of in between.
Yeah.
And then you said after Houston you went on to work with a separate company in consulting. What was that kind of switch like?
Yeah, it was basically the GPS vest, right? That
Okay.
that everyone uses now, right? It was a company based out of Houston that had just acquired funding, and they were a cost-effective alternative, because a lot of this equipment is very
Yeah.
expensive, and clubs pay anywhere between 40 to 200,000 a year to
Mm.
use like the full analytic suite. And so this was a very cost-effective type of company. And so they wanted to break into markets like South America, where, if you're in Brazil, for example, if you're the top clubs, yeah, you can afford it. But if you're a
Mm.
bottom table club, you're not getting Libertadores revenue, right? You're not getting jersey sales revenue because you're not a massive club. You can't afford 40K on technology, right? Especially when you
Mm.
compare the dollar to the Brazilian currency.
Yeah. There's
So,
no.
and no different in Colombia, Uruguay, Argentina, same thing. So my job was to just expand this company, expand this business, and I ended up. My first deal was actually in Brazil,
Mm.
with Flamengo, with their women's team,
Mm.
because their women's team didn't have access to this technology, and because the company was a cost effective alternative, they were
Mm.
able to finally provide this technology to the women's team, which is massive. And then so I started to find kind of like my niche is like second division clubs in Brazil, and for first division clubs, I would target the women's side and the youth academy side, because most youth academy teams didn't use this either.
Right.
So for youth academy, I think I had like Botafogo, Fluminense, Grêmio, some pretty big clubs, that were finally getting the access to this. And from there, from Brazil, kind of started to grow in Uruguay, Colombia, um, Argentina a bit, Peru, Ecuador, and then ended up
Wow.
we ended up transitioning, and then they wanted to open up some markets in Europe. And so in Spain, my first client was actually Rayo Vallecano, their second team,
Mm.
like I guess you would be like their U21s essentially.
Mm.
And that was my first client in Spain. And so I ended up kind of getting in contact with these players, and sometimes I would get on Zooms with the coaches. Like the coaches wanted to further understand how this really worked and how they can use this to kind of adjust their session plans, to adjust recovery, to really tailor the physical demands to the tactical style that they want to play. So it was cool because I was getting FaceTime with coaches, and
Mm-hmm.
they were comfortable enough texting me, asking me questions. And I think there's this perception back then that you needed to be some type of sports science engineer to really relay this information across. But at the end of the day, you just need to make this football language, right?
Yeah.
Okay, you can have all the data in the world, but if you don't have anyone that can break it down and translate it into football language and how this helps me in my training session, it's useless.
Mm-hmm. And so you said you obviously you speak Spanish, you speak English and Portuguese as well. How many other languages do you know?
Portuguese and Italian. Italian,
Oh wow.
I would say like 80%. It's
Yeah,
the
but
newest language, but my Portuguese and my Spanish help me out with the Italian. So I would say Italian listening, I mean, almost 100%. Speaking, I
mhm.
would say, yeah, about like 80%.
Wow. And that
It
must have
depends on the region in Italy. If it's a lot
right.
of slang, then I get lost.
Yeah.
But yeah.
But that must have been huge for that job then, because that's all you're just talking to people all day.
Yeah, it was big time. And even some other bigger companies and competitors at the time, they would choose the company that I work for just because of access to having someone that spoke their language, right?
Hmm.
Like in Brazil, all the companies that sold it in Brazil were American or Ireland based companies, but they didn't have anyone that really spoke the
Wow.
language. They didn't think to say, hey, let's hire a Brazilian to be able to translate stuff. So yeah, so it helped me out for sure. Sales, and I actually met a lot of agents through that, through that experience as well.
Right. And then yeah, so then you were working there. What was the next transition to working as an agent? Obviously, that language and working with the clubs helped that kind of base to get started and build
Yeah.
your contacts and your network. Where what happened? Like where did you stop working with them and then all of a sudden did you go straight into the agency world or how did that work?
I didn't go straight into the agency world.
Hmm.
I knew a decent amount of agents at the time that were
Right.
kind of on their way up and starting to kind of sign bigger clients. I intermediated on a couple deals. Like it was nothing big. It was like lower tier Spain,
Hmm.
some stuff here in the USL, and then I was always under the perception because NFL agents, MLB, NBA, for the most part in the past, you needed to be a lawyer to also be
Hmm.
an agent in the US. And so I was like, I barely got through my undergrad. Honestly, I was like, I'm not going back to school. So then I met an agent, and he explained to me kind of like his pathway, and he went from marketing side from an MLS team to marketing, international marketing for a bank, and then to an agent. And I was like, oh, like when did you go to law school? When did you finish? And he was like, you don't need to be a lawyer. He's like,
Yeah.
you have to. It's smart of you to work with a lawyer, right? But at the end of the day, a U.S. lawyer is going to be pretty useless for you in Europe because
Yeah.
EU law is so different, right? Just like Texas and Florida law is
Yeah.
completely different. So that's when I started, the things started clicking in my head about like, well, if I don't need to be a lawyer, then this is something that I would be interested in pursuing. And I
Hmm.
started just doing more research, connecting with a lot of agents, asking them kind of their experience, how they got started. And then I realized that I did want to be one, right? And I think as an agent starting off, it's very tough to have someone else kind of take you under and like hire you, because what value do you really bring, right?
Right.
If you don't have connections and if you don't have access to players, then you're not useless, but you have very little value for
Yeah, there's
someone.
not.
So
Yeah.
I thought like, well, like let me give myself some value. Let me start, and because I was a coach, because I coached within an MLS organization, the people that I coached with and became friends with ultimately, they
Hmm.
were now in different organizations. So now instead of just having contacts at Houston, I had contacts at Inter Miami, at Philly, San Jose, at New York Red Bull, a lot of other places.
Hmm.
So I started asking them just like feedback and players and things like that. And I really made this decision like, okay, by this year I'm gonna like launch my agency, right? And then I started kind of realizing how expensive it is to really travel and
Yeah,
network
do it
and
all
go
on
to
your own.
these scouting events, and all these things. And so I set myself a plan to say, okay, I'm gonna work a boring remote job that will make me good money, that I can use and be able to save X amount of my paycheck as like my starting off fund, right? Because
Hmm.
I'm not an advocate of borrowing money from like a bank. I already
Right.
owe enough in student loans. I didn't need
Yeah.
to owe any more. So yeah, so I worked kind of like a boring job selling health care software, but it was remote. So if I needed to, if I was able to meet with the club in Atlanta, okay, I go visit a hospital system in Atlanta, the company pays for it, I do my meeting and I fly back home, right? So I got creative with it.
Mhm.
And yeah, it wasn't ideal kind of working for that company, but at the end of the day, it gave me
It
the
paid the
kind of,
bills.
yeah, it paid the bills, and it gave me
Mhm.
the starting off point that I needed to really get started with my agency. And yeah, and then from there, kind of started off with just a couple players, did some stuff in Mexico and USL. And then the more I got connected with other people and clubs, the more I started just growing and growing.
And how long have you been doing that for? How many years have you been an agent now?
It'll be in January, it'll be 3 years.
3 years. Wow. So
Yeah.
all that in 3 years. Doing a lot of
Yeah.
growth.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then what's the most people don't know kind of the behind the scenes of being an agent and what it's like. What are some of your responsibilities, kind of your day to day? What are some of like the unique things that you do that people might not know about?
Me.
Especially because your agency is so interconnected. Like you obviously have the base in Colombia. So if you want to go in and explain that a little bit more, you kind of have a base in Colombia, a base here, and you're kind of in the US and you're kind of building
Yeah.
this like interconnected agency around the world.
Yeah, so I have a director of scouting that's in Colombia. He's in between Colombia and the US.
Mm-hmm.
But being a smaller agency, and I always told myself that I wouldn't get extremely massive, because I
Mm-hmm.
think it's a big responsibility, right? Because a lot of people think that you're just closing deals and your job is to collect a commission after, but the reality is that you're still working with people. You're still working with young kids that will make dumb decisions, that
Mm-hmm.
need guidance, right? Because regardless, if maybe they don't have it at home, maybe they have a group of friends that leads them the wrong way. So I think you're everything. You're a counselor. You're someone that kind of instills discipline in them. You're someone that they can confide in, right? Because you never want a player to hide things from you, no matter how
Right.
bad it is. So it's a lot keeping in touch with them. Like I remember when I first started trying to get like bigger players, right? And speaking to
Mm-hmm.
them, like, I've talked to them and they would be with certain agencies and be like, oh yeah, my agent talks to me, once every 6 months. I'm like,
Right.
you're okay with that? Like, what if, you know what I mean? Like, what if you have an issue with the club, or, you need to go out on loan? Like, what happens? They're like, oh, well, I send an email and, we organize a Zoom call eventually. And I thought it was so kind of like ineffective. And so
Mm-hmm.
I knew that, there's a benefit of obviously having a quantity of players, but there's also a benefit of keeping it smaller and it being a bit more intimate and more personal, knowing their family and all these things. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's a lot. It's a lot, especially because I'm the one that for now I manage all of the clients that I have, and I have about 15 right now, and the youngest one is 15 years old, 14,
Mm-hmm.
15 years old, and then the oldest one is 30 years old. So
Wow. So the full spectrum,
yeah, full spectrum. Yeah.
starting and ending your career almost.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then obviously now that you're still a smaller agency, you're doing all the stuff besides kind of the intermediary work and all that type of stuff. You're doing your day to day finance and your taxes and everything else, right?
Yeah. 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 Well, I hire someone for the tax part just because I don't want to
Right.
mess that up. That'd be a very expensive mistake. But
Yeah, yeah.
but yeah, I hire someone for the tax part. And yeah, certain specialized things I do believe in making sure that someone that is really an expert in the field does that, and
Mhm,
other things I just do because I either have the time for it, or I want to continue to do it.
mhm. And then you do a lot of work, like you just mentioned, in Colombia, but mainly in the US. What are the differences in kind of the tiers, working within the different tiers of the US? So you have like your MLS side of things, then the USL, but there's the two different pro tiers, and then as well as Colombia. I saw you, one of your players had a debut last week, I think it was.
Yeah. Yeah.
What are
Yeah.
kind of the big like differences between the three, working as an agent, but also just with your players and kind of tying all three together, what like kind of working together at the same time, like what is that like?
Yeah, I'll start with Colombia first.
Yeah.
Colombia, it's a very interesting market. Obviously, there's Colombians playing in important teams all over the world, right?
Hmm.
Liverpool, Aston Villa, a lot of different leagues. I think Colombia and South America as a whole, outside of the big clubs, things are a little outdated in terms of how they do things, right? There is
Hmm.
no scouting department. it's all you send this YouTube video to the coach and he approves it, right?
Hmm.
Or you have a relationship with the coach and they know who your player is, no video needed. Oh, how much does he need to earn? If I have that in my budget, we sign.
Hmm.
So I think it's a bit chaotic, but sometimes it does make things easier because you don't have to go through a whole approval process of scouting department putting them into the analytics platform, seeing how they match up with current players and all these things.
Hmm.
But it does get frustrating kind of sometimes when it is outdated, right?
Yeah.
I think USL League One, that's where some of my first deals came about. It's the third tier of the US, obviously, but
Hmm.
there is talent in that that tier and in that league. Um, for the coaches, I think at the end of the day, they want to have a player that is hungry and wanting to prove themselves. And like, look, no one goes to play in the third division for money.
Right.
That's the reality, right? I think they go for an opportunity, either if they're a rookie or maybe they were at a higher level and for some reason they just need to get their confidence back or they need to
Hmm.
get minutes under their belt. And so League One it's good. It has a range. There's a range of teams that do things very well, and there's another range of teams that do not do things very well. They're not very organized. So I think it's just picking and choosing which range you want to really work with.
Right. Hmm.
Um, for championship, I think championship has grown a lot. There's a lot of quality in the league, especially the internationals that are in the league. Championship is a bit more, they do have their GM, right? They have a GM and they have typically a manager, and the two positions are separate. In League One, for the most part, the head coach is also the GM, is also
Right.
the person that negotiates the contracts, right? So it's a lot of hats to wear. But in championship, there is that separation for almost every club. So it's good
Hmm.
because the coach can focus on what they need to focus on, and the manager's in charge of obviously, and typically they do have someone that does scouting as well. So the manager
Hmm.
doesn't just do scouting; they have
Right.
someone else helping them. So they have a wider net of kind of that they can use to be able to look at player profiles, see which player benefits them the most, but also connections. At the end of the day, the good players that end up in USL Championship, whether they're on loan from an MLS side or they're on loan from an Argentinian First Division side, it's
Hmm.
because of the connections that you have, right? Um, and then MLS, obviously, it's evolved a lot even in the past 6 months with Messi
Hmm.
being here. Um, it's more detailed analytics wise in terms of how they scout. They're more careful, obviously, because they're making huge investments in certain players, and if they're paying 2 million for this player, they want to make sure that they either have a resale value or it's a player that could be kind of someone important for the club with years to
Hmm.
come. So I think every league has its own things, no? Own
Yeah. Pros
difficulties.
and
I think,
cons.
yeah, there is a pro to having a very extensive deep dive into a player, analytics wise, statistics wise, but there's also a con to it because other clubs, other countries, maybe they move the process along a little bit quicker, and so you might lose out on a very good player just
Right.
because of how slow your process is internally, right? So I think it depends.
And then working within an organization previously, how has that helped you? Like, does that help you now day to day, kind of working and negotiating with the teams?
100%. Yeah, I
Mm.
think when I was within the MLS organization, I learned or tried to learn all of the MLS rules, even the first team rules, acquisitions, all these things, and they've changed over time. But I just knew that at some point it would benefit me to know it, and I think
Right.
learning the ins and outs of the MLS club, kind of how everything works, the process, and again, every club has their own dynamic, right? Whether it's
Hmm.
a good dynamic or bad dynamic, but every club has their own dynamic. So it gave me a good idea of the chain of command of how things worked. It gave me a good idea of really how to be able to scope out like, okay, who really is the decision maker here, right?
Hmm.
Seeing that from within Houston, and it also gave me an idea of seeing, whenever you see certain things about coaches getting fired or players not working out, from personal experiences of, because I got to see first team training sessions. I mean, like my office and the first team locker room were like, I literally just had to open a door and I was
Wow.
already within like the first team. Houston had a
Hmm.
very small setup at the time, so yeah, it definitely gives me kind of like an advantage. But I also think that the league has changed so much that
Hmm.
there's clubs that I'm sure that have revolutionized and really kind of updated how they do things.
And then we kind of spoke about it. Like I saw your LinkedIn post, I think it was yesterday or the day before, with the USL transfers to Europe and how that's
Yeah.
transitioning. We've also kind of spoken about it before. What are your thoughts on the USL kind of becoming that developmental league that's really starting to pay off? You're seeing multiple players now each window moving over to Europe or moving to MLS and kind of growing their careers, but also you're seeing more players kind of transition to the USL instead of staying in their MLS academy, or whether they're overseas or whatever, they're coming back and kind of rejuvenating their career in the USL and then moving onwards. What are your thoughts on that whole process?
Yeah, I think it's a proven pathway for some players, and the key word is some, right? I don't think
Hmm.
every player could go to USL Championship and ball out and get a transfer to Europe.
Right.
Um, I think it really depends on the player, and it also depends on the organization that they come from, right?
Mm.
Um, there's organizations where maybe if you're a really good, let's say center back, but there's two young homegrown center backs in front of you,
Right.
what are really the chances that your pathway to first team is within 2 or 3 years, right? It
Mm.
might depend more on what they do compared to what you do. And so that's a case where, maybe USL Championship makes sense. I also think that with now, I think, seeing less and less homegrown contracts outside of the clubs that are very, very invested in youth development, like the New York Red
Hmm.
Bulls, the Phillies, etc. But outside of that, almost every club will throw a next pro contract your way if you're a young and up and coming player. And you have to see, okay, like what benefits me the most right now? Is there a pathway within my current club to get to the first team within 1 or 2 years, right?
Hmm.
Or maybe even three. Or if there's an opportunity to go to USL Championship and compete against grown men and really make a name for myself, that could also provide me a platform for something else. Because I do think that there's a massive difference between the competition in USL Championship and Next Pro, because Next Pro, you don't know really what a team's going to look like.
Right.
One day, a Next Pro team could put out 24-year-olds that are just drafted from college, combined with some first team players that need minutes, and the
Yeah.
next weekend you might be playing against 15 and 16-year-olds.
Yeah.
So it's very inconsistent, right? But I think USL Championship, obviously, the level is high and it's getting higher every single year. And again, it is a very tough league to compete in, and you're playing against grown men that have been athletes and been professionals for 5, 6, 7, or even more. So I
Hmm.
think it's kind of like a shock, and not everyone will be able to rise up to the occasion, right? I think you can see with Barajas. Barajas had a very slow startup, but once he
Hmm.
got the hang of it, I mean, he's obviously one of the most important players for his team, and that's a team that's, I think, they're top three in their conference right now. So,
Hmm.
and I think he's like top two in assists, and he might be like top five in goals or something. So yeah, I think it depends on the player.
Right.
If he
Yeah.
stayed at San Jose, where would he be right now? We don't know. That's the reality, right?
Yeah.
Given Kate Cowell, given Matthew Hoppe, who's now there, given any other players that they might bring in. So I think it really depends on the player and the situation that the club that they're coming from, and also it depends on the USL Championship club having a clear idea of how the development plan will look for the player. Because if they
Hmm.
just want a player because they're a national team player, that's the wrong reason to go, right? I have to
Yeah.
see, okay, this is what our development plan for you looks like. This is the type of exposure we're going to try to get for you, and I think that's the correct way about doing it. And hopefully, every USL Championship club is trying to have that type of thought process when they're talking to these young players and trying to convince them to come over.
Right. And then we were kind of speaking earlier about your agency, how you prefer to keep it small and really keep that trust with your players, that you're not just going to
Yeah,
be messaging them every 6 months or whatever, seeing how they're doing.
yeah.
What is your thought process when looking at players to bring into your agency? How do you look at players? How do you scout them? Also, like on the field, but also off the field, which is sometimes more important.
Yeah, I think scouting a player is hard, because especially a young player, because
Hmm.
you might see them go off with a red card because of too much aggressiveness, or they threw a timber tantrum at the ref, whatever it is, but you don't
Hmm.
really know what's going on behind that, right? Is it frustration with the team, with the coach? Is there something going on at home? So I always try to find out and have people kind of close to the player that could give me some insight onto the player, the family, because one bad game does not mean that or one bad reaction does not mean that, that's how the player actually is. So outside of obviously how comfortable they are on the ball, right? Their tactical awareness, their movement, their work ethic, which is very, very big. I think in any league, but especially with midfielders, right? The work ethic needs to be there. And the body language. I think body language is very, very important. And some kids, it takes them a while to learn that, right? Especially if
Right.
you're U15, U17. And when I say body language, I don't just mean walking around the field, because there's players that can do that and be effective when the ball gets to their feet, right? I
Yeah.
think more when you get called for a foul that wasn't really a foul, right? How switched on are, do you complain about it, or do you just immediately try to make sure that you don't get caught, off guard with a counter? Or
Hmm.
when your team goes down by 2 goals very early, right? What is your reaction? How do you uplift your teammates? Those are the things that really can give you more insight onto what type of player that is, because when you have a player that's a leader on top of being very good with the ball and having a good technical awareness, then that's when you could possibly have, like a star in your hands, or
Hmm.
a very player with high potential.
Yeah, because I think you get to a certain level where everyone's at the same level. There's
Yeah.
very few differentiators, and so I think finding those unique attributes besides just being a good soccer player, I think is the kind of the difference maker.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%.
And then while we're talking about your agency and kind of the players that you look for, what differentiates your agency from others and you from other agents? What are kind of some things that you're proud of and things that you strive for?
I would say I'm no different than some other smaller agencies out there, honestly.
Hmm.
I would say that the one thing that I try to focus on is being transparent, is making sure that the player has a clear plan, and also teaching them. I think a big part of this, especially when you get a player at a young age, it's the education part of this. They need to
Hmm.
understand why you're doing certain things, or why you think a certain way. And same thing with the parents. One, it helps me out because I don't have them or parents asking me 20 different questions.
Yeah.
But also, that's where you build more trust, and you show, like, look, we have nothing to hide. This is how
Right.
much I'll make from you from the commission. This is why you're going to this club instead of that club, right? I think you build trust that way, because I think the one complaint that I've heard in the past with players and even parents is that they always felt like the agents kind of just said, "Oh, just let us take care of it. Let us sort it out, and
Mhm.
you focus on playing." And sometimes players want to know. Sometimes parents want to know, like, the reasoning behind certain things. And so, I think that's really what I try to focus on the most.
Right.
Um, and yeah, I mean, I just try to be there, try to be available, try to get them opportunities. Look, there's some times where you might go on trial and it might not work out, right?
Mhm.
Um, it's not the player's fault. It's not the agent's fault sometimes, right? And it's a learning opportunity.
Mhm. No, 100%. And then, so you've been an agent now for 3 years. You've kind of had a vast career in the MLS world and kind of coaching and everything. What are some of the cool success stories or just stories that you've experienced either in the past working in an MLS organization or now as an agent now in the last 3 years?
I think hands down the coolest one was Ryan Jeba's transfer to Minnesota
Mm.
United. So he's the first and the only, as of now, player from the third tier of the U.S. to get transferred directly to a first team deal in MLS.
Mhm.
I think there's a lot of moving parts to that. It was Omaha having a deep Open Cup run. So he got to play against 3 MLS sides. It
Yeah.
was also Jiba rising to the occasion of and performing well, right, against those
Mhm.
3 sides. And I think he had at the time very good coaches that were very good guys for him, that were really pushing him, that were doing the best that they could to make sure that he got a good platform. Right. That was and Minnesota wasn't the only offer that he had. I mean, he had 8 MLS offers, some
Wow.
first team, some second team, but that's still 8 MLS clubs
Mhm.
interested in this one kid from League One,
Mhm.
So I think that's the coolest story. Unfortunately, he's been injured and had some injuries during the preseason, so he hasn't been able to debut for Minnesota. But he just turned 22, I think, so he
Yeah,
still has some
still
time,
got
right?
plenty of time.
But I think it shouldn't discredit kind of everything that he did to get there, just to get to that
Hmm.
point. Because I think almost any League One player would tell you that they would die for an opportunity for to sign for a first team, right? And
Hmm.
just be within that environment.
Definitely. No, I agree. It's a cool story. It's unique. It's a one of one. You can't really,
Yeah,
not a lot of people can tell that story.
yeah.
And then kind of working into that, what are some tips? Like there's people that follow this podcast that are either wanting to become agents or still early days of being an agent. What are some tips or things you would recommend to someone if they say, "Hey, like I'm looking to be an agent, kind of where should I start or how should I start?" Kind of the pathway to get into the industry.
I would say connect with as much people as you can. I would say try to get in, even if you can, right? Volunteering with your local USL2 club, your local USL League One club, Championship club. I think almost any USL club would be willing to take an intern,
Right.
especially if they don't have to pay them.
Mm-hmm.
It is tough, obviously, in this economy, and it kind of depends on their situation. But
Mm-hmm.
trying to get into a club and really learning the ins and outs, because you will meet a lot of people along the way, and players. You never know, like players that you help out could end up, being agents themselves, or they could end up making a move to an MLS side, and you end up getting an inside, someone on the inside there, right? I
Yeah.
think connecting with people as much as you can, and I think being educated in the sense of when you go to speak to someone, try to do some background information just so you have something to talk about. And you also, people want to know that you've done some type of homework,
Right.
because I don't think anyone wants to sit there and just give you the blueprint to do everything,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And no matter the industry, right, especially the
Mm-hmm.
industry as lucrative as the football industry. And so do some homework, right? Try to have some talking points, and show that you have done your homework, and it'll get you a long way. And that's something that I personally try to do for the clubs that I speak to. When I speak to a
Mm-hmm.
club, I try to I go on Y Scout, I watch some of their games, I look at there's even now, like I think John Morrissey from USL Tactics, like he does these articles
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
it literally breaks everything down for you, their playing style, what type of players is most ideal for them, all these things. And so there's no excuses to you know not being able to find out this information,
Mm-hmm.
right? But I do these things so that way when I speak to these managers and these coaches, they see that actually I've done my homework. I'm not just
Right.
offering a player just because I need somewhere to place him. I say, okay,
Mm-hmm.
look, I've seen how you play. I've seen the type of player profile that you like. I think he fits the bill, but I need your confirmation to know if that's actually true.
No, I actually really like that. That's good. That's some good advice. And if we were to sit down in 5 to 10 years, let's say, and have this interview again, where do you think you'd be? And do you kind of look into the future and get ideas of where you want to be, or do you kind of just go day by day and keep hustling?
I don't really look into the future too much, and that's something
Mm-hmm.
that I've tried to stop doing. I think when I first started, I tried to do that too much, and you end up comparing yourself to other people, and you
Right.
don't know what went on for that other person for them to either be successful or not be successful.
Mm-hmm.
And so I try not to do that. I try to just live day by day and be more conscious of the progress that I've made, right? Comparing day one from when I started to now,
Right.
and the context that I have and the people that I speak with and the players that I've been very close to representing or signing.
Mm-hmm.
I just try to enjoy the process. And at the end of the day, the whole point of being an entrepreneur and owning your own agency is the fact
Mm-hmm.
that you can be your own boss and you can make your own decisions and enjoy what you do. Right. And I think that's the best part, that my job is to be able to just watch football games and talk to
Yeah.
players and talk to coaches and directors. I mean, it's not bad to get, when you get your commission, it's not bad to get paid to do that. Right.
Right. No, that's a good mentality to have. So that's the bulk of our big questions here. We've got some just little quick fire questions here to get to know you a little bit more.
Yeah.
First one, what's your favorite team? Do you have a team that you fully support? or are you kind of just? I know
I
agents, once you kind of get into the world, it's kind of like, do you just support your players, or how does this all work?
Yeah, I don't have a team that like I fully support. I will
Mm-hmm.
say, growing up, Barcelona was my first kind of intro into La Liga, Spain in general, watching games, and so
Mm-hmm.
Barcelona is a team that I grew up watching a lot, and I still do. But you know, if they lose a game, it won't ruin my
It's
week.
not the
Trust
yeah,
me.
not the end of the world.
Yeah, it's
So
not that
Colombia, we
serious,
can
not that
say
deep.
Colombia is Colombia. Would you say that's like kind of your team that has your heart as a national team?
As a national team, yes.
Mm-hmm.
I am not Colombian. However,
Oh, okay, I didn't know
I
that.
have a
I thought
very
you
deep
were.
connection. No, I have a very deep connection to Colombia now because one of my first players, you know, that I signed is in Colombia.
Oh, okay,
My wife is Colombian. Um, and I don't know,
that's where it
like
all ties in.
I love the culture. Like I love
Mm-hmm.
like the first time that I went there, like I was in love with just the culture and how nice the people are, the football too. I mean, the atmosphere, everything. And so when you tie that all together, I mean, yeah, like what is there not to like, right? And
Right.
so I would say, yeah, I root for the Colombian national team 100%.
And while we're talking about national teams, what are kind of your quick thoughts on the World Cup coming to North America? Are you looking forward? Is Houston a host city?
Houston is a host city, yeah,
Oh man, that's
yeah,
gonna be.
yeah. I live 20 minutes from the stadium where the game's gonna be. Um, I think it's gonna explode, and I think you'll even start to see kind of the soccer scene explode even before that. I
Right.
think when 2025 hits, obviously the USL Championship will have probably close to 40 teams. MLS will
Mm-hmm.
probably add another team. Um, so I think it's going to provide a massive boom. I don't know how much further up. I mean, soccer's already pretty high in
Yeah.
most popular sports, but I think when you read articles nowadays, like more and more parents are you know they rather their kids get into soccer
Mm-hmm.
than American football than baseball because of how expensive those other sports are getting to, or
Yeah.
because of the risk related to those other sports at a young age. But I think it's going to be great for the cities. It's going to be economically it'll be great, but also just to grow the sport even more. And I think people will be surprised at the type of performance that the U.S. has for that playing on
Yeah.
home soil. So
And I think within the U.S., soccer still hasn't become a major sport. Like you still have your football and your
yeah.
basketball as kind of your two big ones. But I think as a third sport, like it's really competing now with the MLB. I think that's kind of the level that it's at. So I think now it'll really take over that third spot and make it kind of one of the majors in the U.S.
Yeah, but not only that, but just think about how many like famous actors and
Yeah.
NBA players, NFL players, MLB players are now investing in soccer, whether it's
Hmm.
here in the US or whether it's in the Premier League or whether it's
Or
another
even
country.
Wrexham.
But yeah, Wrexham, right? But like, you know, 10 years ago, if you would have said that, you know, there's at least 10 NFL players that have an ownership stake in a professional soccer
Hmm.
team, it would have been like, why? What's the point?
Yeah.
Right? And so imagine, you know, if that's right now, imagine how it'll be, you know, by the time the World Cup happens or even after that.
Hmm. All right, so the next one we have here is favorite quote or saying. Do you have something that you kind of look back to that inspires you?
Um, Not really. I think
Yeah,
my favorite saying is more, it's the one that has, you know, it's like luck is when preparation meets opportunity, right?
I like that.
I think you know, I think everyone needs a little bit of luck to be successful, right? No
Hmm.
matter how well connected you are, everyone needs that little bit of luck to be successful. But what you do with it and how you use that as a platform is really about how prepared you were, right, for that moment. Like
Hmm.
Chiba, for example.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's something you can work as hard as you want, but just that little bit of luck. I think anyone
Yeah,
can get lucky, but it doesn't really mean anything. But if you add in all the work you've been putting, and then oh you happen to bump into someone that day, and that takes you to the next level, then I think that's where I agree. I like that. I like that saying.
exactly. Yeah.
And then if I'm ever visiting Houston, I need some top recommendations. So do you have like a good spot to go to or like a food spot? Do you have somewhere that you would recommend to people when they visit?
I'm not a foodie, but I
Okay.
will say Houston has a very diverse population.
Hmm.
So whatever you're craving when you come here, you can find it. If you want Polish food, if you want Jamaican food, if you want
Really?
Dominican food, you can find whatever you want within Houston,
Hmm.
which is, I think, is a cool part. You get a big variety. And whenever I go to these other states, and I either visit MLS clubs, USL clubs, or even just my players in general,
Hmm.
I'm always just I'm thankful and grateful for the variety that I have in Houston, because when I go there, I'm like, oh, what should I eat? It's like, well, I really only have three options here, right?
Yeah.
And we're talking about like major cities, right? So,
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's what I like the most about it, and it just really depends on what you're craving, but you'll be able to
All right.
find it
Because
for sure.
yeah, because I'm a big foodie, so I always like to find my spots that I gotta go. So the next one we got is favorite book. Are you a reader? I know some people aren't. I'm kind of in between. When I sit down, I sometimes get a chance to read, but most of the time I'm just on my phone.
Recently this year, I became a big reader,
Hmm.
honestly. Whether it's like business books, whether it's like football books. The the one that I have liked the most is called Build the Invisible, or Building the Invisible. It's by
Hmm.
Daniel Gay. He's one of the um, biggest kind of lawyers in the UK, and he helps facilitate on the legal side like really big transfers and really big contracts, like Declan Rice to Arsenal, for example. Like he
Hmm.
does a lot of big work with Premier League guys, but he's also he's a big writer. He publishes a lot of books, and I think Build the Invisible, it's cool because it just talks about, it can be applied to whether you're an agent and building your agency, or
Hmm.
whether you're starting a restaurant, right? It just talks about like the little things to take into account, and processes to think about and put into place.
No, I gotta add that one. I've started recently listening to his podcast because I don't really listen to
Yeah,
music or anything else. I just listen to podcasts, and I
yeah, yeah,
I quite like what he has to say.
yeah.
Do you have a favorite hobby outside of soccer? Something to just get your head away from things and just relax.
Outside of soccer,
It's a
not
tough
really.
one. Yeah.
Probably hanging out with my wife
Hmm.
whenever she's not working, and with my dogs. I have three dogs,
Okay.
so probably like
So
taking
you're
them to the
busy.
park and yeah, hanging out with
Hmm.
them. Yeah, yeah.
No, that's a good one. And then do you have an idol or someone you look up to? It can be within soccer or just in general. Someone that just inspires you to kind of keep going.
An idol, not really.
No, yeah, no, that's all right.
Not
That's cool.
really. No. I think in terms of players wise,
Hmm.
someone that I've always looked up to is Messi,
Okay.
100%. Just because of, obviously, despite kind of the obstacles that he's had, and
Hmm.
the things that he's gotten through, and the different places that he's gone to, I think the World Cup kind of is proof that he
He's the
climbed the
best.
mountaintop, right? Like he's
Hmm.
he's the best in my opinion, right? And I think everyone has their own opinion, but in my opinion, he's the GOAT. So
No, I like it. Have you had a chance to watch him or no?
live,
Yeah.
no. My first chance to watch him live was actually, I was in Italy, and it was Inter Milan Barca Champions League, and it was my first Champions League game,
Okay.
and he was scheduled to play, but they pulled him out of the warm up because he felt like a little tweak, and so they
Yeah.
sat him. And I was like, it was the best seats I've ever had in my life. I was like four rows up from the field,
That's
and
the
it was,
worst.
yeah, I was so disappointed, but it was still like a really high quality match to watch. And
Hmm.
because Inter Milan needed to win, and they needed to depend on the result of someone else to go through,
Right.
and Barcelona was already qualified basically, so they were like, well, we don't really need it
Yeah, it
anyway
doesn't
if we're
really.
already through. So
And Houston plays Inter Miami tonight or something, right? For the Open
tonight,
Cup.
yeah, yeah,
Is it in
7:30.
Houston or where is it?
No, it's in
Oh.
Miami. It's in
Oh, okay.
Miami. Yeah,
I had the only time I've watched him was in Paris. I was just in Paris a few months ago,
yeah.
but it was when he came back from that. He was in Saudi Arabia or something,
Oh
and so he
yeah,
wasn't he wasn't supposed to play. So I bought the tickets, and they were like, "He's not playing. He's not playing." I'm like, "Come on!" Like, and Neymar was out as well, so it's just really like Mbappe out of the big stars.
yeah. You
But
had to see
last minute,
Mbappe though. I mean,
no, but he played. He ended up playing.
oh, he did.
The
Wow.
day before they were like, "You're good to play," but he was booed the whole time. Every time he touched the ball.
Yeah,
It was a weird experience
yeah,
because I'm like, this is the greatest player of all time. We're just
yeah.
booing him. Like it was
Yeah,
a
I
weird
would
feeling.
feel so cringe,
Yeah,
hearing the stadium boo Messi when he touches the ball. I
he
couldn't
set
do
up.
it.
They won. I think they ended up winning like 4-1 or something. And by the third or fourth goal, he hadn't scored or assisted, but he had set everything up.
Yeah.
and by the fourth one they just stayed
Took
silent. No
Yeah.
one booed or anything.
Yeah. At that
They
point, like,
realized what they
what
had.
can you say, right?
Yeah. Well, that's all I've got for you. So I want to say, first of all, thank you for coming on, and yeah, we'll keep in touch. And I appreciate you coming on.
No, I'm a big fan of the podcast, and no, I appreciate you giving me a platform to talk a little bit about my journey.
Of course, it's always something I find people don't really get the opportunity in this industry. Like we've had scouts on, agents, even players. A lot of people don't really get that chance to kind of say what they want to say to people that want to listen. People want to hear kind of the behind the scenes of what happens.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
All right, see you soon, and we'll keep in touch.
All right, thanks, man.
Have a good one.
Wanna hear you go.